The joint hospital on Vethsalen Station had two staff lounges, one commissary, and one break room that was technically shared but had developed, over the 14 months of the station's operation, into a space that was Solvani in the morning and human in the afternoon, through the kind of unspoken mutual accommodation that happened when two groups of people were too professional to negotiate openly and too pragmatic to pretend the preference didn't exist. James Okafor ate his lunch in the afternoon break room, which meant he was usually the last human in it and the first to hear the Solvani medical staff arriving for their evening consultations through the wall, which conducted sound at a frequency that made their language precise, harmonic, built on tonal distinctions his ears registered, but his brain couldn't parse, sound like something between music and mathematics. He had been at the joint hospital for 6 weeks. His assignment orders described his function as routine injury support, which in practice meant he spent his shifts cycling through the triage units handling the volume that the Solvani medical staff, extraordinary in their specialty, genuinely not trained for high-throughput trauma, found operationally inefficient. He was fast and competent in the way of someone who had learned the fundamentals in environments that didn't allow for slow or incompetent. And the Solvani physicians he worked alongside had developed the specific respect for him that expertise recognized across methodological difference, professional, warm in the Solvani register, and coexisting comfortably with the quiet certainty that their medicine was 4,000 years more advanced than his. He had no argument with this. It was true. What was also true, and what he had been sitting with since a Tuesday evening 3 days ago, was that more advanced and currently working were not always the same sentence. The pediatric isolation unit was on the 3rd floor of the Solvani wing. He had no professional reason to be near it. He had passed it twice on the route between the shared commissary and his assigned triage station, registered the case status display on the door in the way. He registered all medical information in his vicinity, and stopped registering it the way he stopped registering anything that wasn't his business, which was a discipline his career had built in him and his instincts had always argued with. On the Tuesday evening, he had gone back. The terminal alcove outside the isolation unit was unoccupied, the case notes accessible to any credentialed hospital staff, and he had no official reason to read them. He read them anyway, with the focused attention he brought to the kind of problem that didn't resolve cleanly at the edges, the kind that kept rearranging itself in his peripheral thinking until he gave it direct attention. Genetic cascade failure. 4 weeks in, every Solvani intervention applied in the correct sequence, producing the correct results, and the cascade advancing regardless. The attending physician's notes were a document in 2 registers. The clinical language of a very good doctor doing everything correctly, and underneath it, in the data she was recording with the precision of someone who needed the record to be exact because the record was the only thing she could control, something that had no medical term but was readable anyway. The attending physician was also the child's mother. He hadn't needed the personal notation at the bottom of the file to know that. He had read it in the notes. He went back to his quarters. He made tea. He sat with the problem in the methodical way of a man who had learned that some situations needed to be slept on before they were acted on, and discovered by morning that this one was not sleeping. He spent 3 days reading everything in the hospital's shared database about immune-mediated intervention in pediatric cascade events, which in the Solvani database meant 3 articles from 4,000 years ago, filed under historical approaches, obsolete with the specific archaeological interest of a civilization that had moved past these methods and kept the record for completeness. He read field medicine texts. He read the notes from a training rotation 5 years ago on a planet with a failed equipment grid and a 3-week supply lag, where the senior medic had told him something he'd written in the back cover of his training manual and never forgotten. When the fancy tools are gone, the body is the tool. Learn to use it. He wrote the protocol in 3 drafts. He printed it, because he'd noticed that the Solvani read physical documents differently, with a kind of deliberate attention they didn't always give to screen text, and he thought this was the kind of document that needed to be read deliberately. He knocked on the observation room door on a Thursday afternoon, with 12 pages under his arm and the specific preparedness of someone who has fully expected to be shown the door and has decided to try anyway. "Doctor." Sale Vornitha looked at him the way she had been looking at the terminal for the past 4 hours, with the flat, exhausted attention of someone who had run out of the resources required to perform a reaction and was operating on baseline. She was tall by Solvani standards and slight in the way of someone who had not eaten with intention in several days, and her secondary circulatory markings, the bioluminescent lines that ran from her temples to her collarbones in the diagnostic pattern her species used to read internal states, were the dull amber of sustained depletion. "Corporal," she said. "Doctor." He held up the protocol document. "I have something I'd like you to look at. I understand if you don't want to. I'm going to leave it here either way." She looked at the document. She looked at him. "You've been reading the case file." "Yes," he said without apology, because apologizing for paying attention had always seemed to him like the wrong instinct. "I work across the hall. I read what I walk past." "And you have a protocol." "I have something that's been classified as obsolete emergency medicine for 4,000 years, he said, "and that I used on a field rotation 5 years ago when the alternative was nothing." He set the document on the table. "Page 8 is the mechanism. Page 11 is the pediatric adaptation I worked out from the base parameters. It might be completely wrong for a Solvani pediatric cascade. I think it's worth knowing whether it is." He left. He went back to the human wing, ate dinner, filed his shift report, and did not go back to the observation room. He had made the case as clearly as he could and added nothing to it, which was the only thing he knew how to do with situations that weren't his to decide. At 11 that night his communicator registered a message from Dr. Vornitha. It contained 4 words and a question mark. Page 9. "Inflammatory threshold. Explain," he explained. She sent 6 follow-up questions. He answered all 6. They went back and forth in the clipped, precise shorthand of 2 medical professionals who had stopped thinking about the fact that it was 2 in the morning, and by 4 he had sent her the full theoretical framework, and she had sent him a single line. "I'm making calls in the morning." He put down the communicator and sat on the edge of his bunk in the dark and thought about page 11, which he had written and rewritten 4 times because pediatric parameters in a species he had never treated before were a real variable, and he had tried to be honest in the protocol about exactly how real it was. He thought about the case notes. He thought about the 2 registers in which they were written. Then he went to sleep, because the thing about medicine was that worry didn't do the work. The work did the work. The treatment took 11 days to show results. The first 3 were the worst, which the protocol document had anticipated, and which James had tried to prepare Sale for in language that was accurate without being discouraging, a balance he had not fully achieved. Controlled inflammatory response in practice looked a great deal like making a sick child temporarily sicker, and the Solvani medical staff observing the protocol had the specific expression of people watching a methodology they considered historically superseded being applied to a patient in their facility, which was several kinds of professionally uncomfortable simultaneously. He was not officially part of the treatment team. He was present because Sale had asked, with the precise phrasing of someone establishing a logistically defensible reason, that the protocol's designer be available for consultation during the active treatment phase. His commanding officer had looked at this request for a long moment, and then signed the authorization with the expression of a man exercising strategic ignorance. James stood in doorways mostly. He answered questions when Sale had them, quickly, specifically, without the defensiveness of someone whose methodology was being questioned, because the methodology should be questioned, and the questions made it better. He watched the data with the attention of someone who had learned to read bodies the way other people read text, for what the numbers said directly, and for what they were organizing underneath. On the fourth day, Dr. Velsara, the most senior Solvani physician on the joint hospital's staff, a woman who had published 47 papers on genetic cascade intervention, and had, in the first days of the treatment, maintained the polite skepticism of someone humoring a desperate colleague, reviewed the morning data and said nothing for a long time. Then she said, in standard, which she used when she wanted to be certain of being understood, "The immune response is interfering with the cascade propagation." She paused. "That shouldn't be possible with a Solvani cascade." "The cascade is running on a chaotic mutation pattern," James said from the doorway. "Precision intervention keeps missing it because the target keeps moving. The immune stimulation doesn't aim. It just makes the whole environment hostile to the mutation's replication conditions." Dr. Velsora looked at him with an expression he recognized as the scientific face of someone revising a category. "Your medicine weaponizes imprecision," she said. "We had a long time to get good at it," he said, "before we got good at precision." The cascade slowed on the 7th day, interrupted on the 10th. On the morning of the 11th day, Sale was in the observation room when the overnight data populated the monitoring display, and she stood very still in front of it for a moment, and then sat down in the chair behind her. Not the careful, controlled sitting of a physician reviewing data, but the sitting of a person whose legs have made a decision without consulting them. James was in the doorway. He saw it happen. He did not say anything because there was nothing useful to say, and because the moment was hers entirely, and because some things needed to exist for a moment before language was put anywhere near them. After a while she said, very quietly, "The markers are reversing." "Yes," he said, "the cascade has stopped." "Yes." She looked at the display for another long moment. "She's going to be all right," she said, and the two registers in which she had been writing case notes for 5 weeks collapsed briefly into one, not the physician's, not the controlled one. And then she took a breath and put them back and turned to look at him with a steadiness that had cost her something but was real. "Thank you," she said. He shook his head. "She did it," he said. "The protocol gave her body the conditions. She did the rest." "You gave her the conditions," Sale said, "when no one else did." He didn't argue with that. He didn't have a professional reflex for it, and it was true, and the moment didn't need managing. He just stood in the doorway and nodded once. From inside the isolation unit, through the observation glass, Vale, 6 years old and opinionated, and in the process of being more all right than she had been in 5 weeks, looked directly at the doorway and said, in standard, clearly and with the specific impatience of a child who had been watching this pattern for days, "You human, come in or go away. Doorways are for walking through." James looked at Sale. Sale looked at James with an expression that was, for the first time in 11 days, slightly amused. He walked through the door. The discharge paperwork took 3 days, which was fast for Solvani administrative processing, and positively instantaneous compared to the secondary documentation that arrived on James's personal terminal on the morning of the 2nd day. A formal notification in the Solvani legal framework, translated into standard with the careful accuracy of a system that understood that accurate and easy to receive were not always achievable simultaneously. He read it twice. He read the relevant section a 3rd time. He read the definition of Vethsorvan in the attached legal glossary, and then sat in the break room with his tea going cold and thought about it for a while. Whoever preserves a life when all accepted methods fail acquires parental status equivalent to biological origin. By demonstration of protective capability, the biological line cannot provide. He was still sitting there when Sale came into the break room on her way to the consultation wing, stopped when she saw his expression, looked at the terminal, and sat down across from him with the careful preparation of a physician about to deliver news she has already given herself time to process. "You knew this was the legal consequence," he said, not accusing, clarifying. I knew it was a possibility, she said. I told myself I would address it when and if it became relevant. She paused. It became relevant. He looked at the document. Parental status, equivalent to biological origin. Yes, for Vale. Yes, a child I met 11 days ago. 12, she said, including the day you first spoke to her. He looked at her with the expression of a man who appreciated precision, but had opinions about its timing. That's not the clarification I needed most right now. I know, she said. I apologize. She set her hands flat on the table in the way she had of doing things deliberately when she was making herself be direct. The Veth Sorvan exists because my civilization has encountered this situation before, a life preserved by means outside the family's capacity, and the law needing to define what that creates. The logic is not ceremonial. A being who can protect a life in ways the parents cannot has demonstrated a capability the law considers parentally relevant. It's recognition and obligation together. I'm a combat medic on a 6-month contract, he said. I'm aware of your assignment, she said. I don't have any idea how to be a parent to a Solvani child. You sat on the edge of the visitor's chair in the isolation unit, she said, and told her the atmospheric processor probably had opinions about its job. She laughed for the first time in 5 weeks. She looked at him steadily. You know more than you think you know. He was quiet for a moment. Then, does she know? I told her this morning. Sale's expression moved through something that was brief and complicated and resolved into its own kind of warmth. She said, and I'm quoting accurately, I already decided he could be my father. I was waiting for the paperwork to catch up. James looked at the terminal. He looked at the ceiling. He looked at the terminal again. She's 6, he said. 6.5, Sale said. She want me to be accurate. Of course she would, he said, and something in his voice had shifted, not resolved, not arrived anywhere, but shifted in the direction of a person who was beginning, against considerable odds and without prior consent, to be fond of a situation he had not applied for. I want to be honest with you, Sale said. The law is clear, but what it means in practice, what we make of it, the three of us, that's not something the law defines. That's something we'd have to build. From here, he said. From here, she agreed. Wherever here leads. He thought about that. He thought about 12 pages of protocol document printed on physical paper. He thought about a child in a hospital bed with her mother's precise gray eyes telling him that doorways were for walking through. He thought about the specific, unplanned quality of things that mattered. How few of them had ever arrived with prior notice in his experience, and how many of them he'd been standing in the doorway of before he walked through. I'd want to do it right, he said. I don't know what right looks like yet. Neither do I, she said. I know what I want it to look like. She said this last part in the careful tone of someone making an admission they've decided is worth making. That's not the same as knowing. He nodded slowly. He picked up his cold tea, registered its temperature, set it down. She really said she'd already decided. The exact words were, obviously, he fixed me when nobody else could. That means he's my father. Why is everyone taking so long? The laugh arrived before he planned it, sudden, genuine, the specific laugh of a person being undone by something true. He tried to manage it and failed completely, which was the kind of failure that felt, in the break room on the morning of the 12th day, like the right kind. On the afternoon before discharge, the three of them were in the hospital's shared garden, a pressurized biosphere on the station's outer ring, planted with species from 6 different civilizations, maintained with the dedicated chaos of a gardener who believed that compatibility was more interesting than uniformity. Vale had opinions about the plants, delivered with the specificity of a 6.5-year-old who had spent 5 weeks in a hospital bed with limited input, and had stored up a significant quantity of conclusions in the interim. That one is doing too much, she said, pointing at a flowering specimen with considerable architectural ambition. I think it's trying, James said. Trying too hard, she said. There's a difference. She looked at him with her mother's precise gray eyes and the unfiltered directness of a child who had not yet acquired the habit of diplomatic softening. "Are you going to be around after here?" He glanced at Sale. Sale looked at the garden with the expression of a person who had agreed not to answer first. "I think so," he said. "We're working on what that looks like." Vale considered this, with the focus she gave to things that required proper assessment. "Good," she said. "You can keep being useful." "High praise," he said. "I'm 6.5," she said. "High praise from me is useful. Some people never get that far." She moved on to the next plant, which she had also identified as overreaching, and delivered her verdict with the calm finality of someone closing a case. Sale came to stand beside him in the garden light, and they watched Vale work her way through the biosphere with the methodical confidence of a person who had been almost not here and was now here completely. Opinionated and specific and entirely herself, and the station turned in its slow orbit above them, and the garden held its comfortable chaos, and neither of them said anything because the moment was not the kind that needed it. James had walked through a door 11 days ago that he had knocked on without permission and left a piece of paper through, and then waited to see what happened. Something had happened. He was still figuring out the shape of it. The edges were new, and he hadn't mapped them yet. But standing in the garden in the afternoon light with a child informing an ornamental shrub of its failures, and a physician who had trusted him with the only thing she had, he understood